Cool. Okay. Hi everyone. Welcome to Seger Sparring. I'm Kushai. I'll be your chair. With me are Joshua and Sam. Okay. Have fun. To start the debate, I call upon Prime Minister. Here.
Am I audible?
You are.
Okay. Wait. Wait for a minute. Listen, what's evaluation. Okay. Ambil timer. As usual, my preference POI is no POI. But yeah, if you want to do POI, just open your mic, but probably will not respond because I'm a coward and I am upfront with it. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. What do we mean by actually actively teach school children that they should be faithful to their partners? Is by the teachers is actually making it an active curriculum to, basically like a tone down of sex educations that you say that, oh, you actually pegangan tangan with this girl and they hamil, yaudah, kayak with this girl aja, nggak usah panik, and then just having a good relationship with this kind of girl, right? So what do we mean by faithfulness is that we teach them to what is the meaning of commitment and being honesty and being vulnerable. It means that when you are with this certain relationship with your certain partners, you need to open up what you are feeling, because faithfulness cannot come in a one-way relationship. It needs to be a two-way relationship. Like, so when you are being vulnerable to your partner, you broke down your walls, you actually being faithful that your partner need, and actually your partner have the responsibility to also break down their walls and also being vulnerable and also being honest. And I think me and Grace think that this is actually a kickstart of a good relationship, for their future, relationship in endeavor, right? So we're also going to teach them like an ups and down, or potential ups and down of when you actually being in the relationship, right? For example, like, oh, you're actually fighting with your partner, right? But does that mean that you should end the relationship? You should talk it out with them, and I think that they can be and I think that they can actually listen to you, because that's the idea of being mutual faithfulness. And I think that this can happen because when the school children actually teach, when the school teachers is actually teaching these children that you should have a mutual faithfulness, right? Because I think that we can see that these kind of harms of being faithful to their partners, you're going to create a false hope that your partners are actually going to listen to you when they are not. That is exactly why abusive relationship happens, for example. But I think that the current status quo that and the harms that happens is exists is because I think there is an absence of these motions, and I think these motions will going to fix that, right? So two things that I'm going to start in my speech. Number one, how it kickstart people romantic journey to be better. But secondly is that we're going to also the threat of a sexual exploration, for example, or romantic explorations. Why it is something that we can actually still happens in our side of the house, right? Oh yeah, basically also tambahan stance. We teach them since SD. So I think that like SD masih bisa pacaran aja gitu loh, kayak it's not something that is harmful. So yeah, so why this argument? So number one, how it kickstart people romantic journey to be better. So why this is important, right? Because when you teach this kind of matter to this kind of to school children, there are, for example, like SD, for example, from the start, they are most probably are demographic of people that are never or still not yet experiencing first love. And I think that first love is something that's important in your romantic journey, right? That is why, for example, childhood love always exists as a trope in anime, for example, because I think that childhood love is a patient zero of your romantic journey. That is how you experience how you experience love and any benefit and harm that implies. But secondly is that I think that scientifically, in your brain, you store your first love and all the experience in a certain part of your brain. That is why your experience with your first love, like what I have with my first love, is lingering much more longer rather than other partner that I have experienced. I think this scientifically proven. Secondly, last but not least, I think that the most important part of having childhood love is that you always compare your current affairs and all the future affairs that you have with your first love in the end of the day, right? So this is why when we understand that on how first love is very, very important, we need to establish a good first love rather than making the first love to be a bad experience that these kind of children will going to have, and it's going to wreck any future relationship that they have, right? Why this is exclusive happens in government side, in opposition side of the house, right? Because I think that when your first love and all your and first relationship is actually a bad relationship, I think we can establish that every bad relationship is rooted from this partner are being unfaithful, right? Your first love is not committing toward your relationship. For example, they're taking the relationship for granted. But especially when it comes to first love, that people that love that experience by these children that are most likely irrational. These people are nafsuan, for example. When you see, when you have relationship with Dita, when you have relationship with Dita, but also Nurul is much more prettier, for example, even though you know that Nurul is much stupid, for example, right? But you are nafsuan, you're irrational as a children. So therefore you go to Nurul instead of Dita that you have. Like this is exactly, yeah, motion open final Jovet, right? But also like in your first love of your childhood, right? When you experience first sight, for example, you directly think that your relationship is not worth it, and therefore you're going to directly end the relationship in of itself, right? I think that we already established on how the root of bad relationship is actually the partners are being unfaithful toward one another, right? And I think this is bad because when you experience a bad first love, the kickstart of your romantic journey will also going to be bad. When your first love is a cheater, you always think your future relationship is a cheater. That is why Grace always says that men are trash, because the first love that she has is trash in of itself, right? So that's why I think that we need to have a good first love to kickstart a good romantic journey for this individual. And I think this can only happen when you teach them how to create a good faithfulness to your partner, to one another. And I think this can only happen when you teach them since young. But if oppositions might say that, hey, this is going to limit sexual explorations of people, because when you're going to be chained to your partner forever because of this norm that are being taught since education, right? No, I don't think so, right? I think the sexual exploration in of itself, it comes from you being unfaithful, right? You lose faith to your partner just because you say that, hey, my sexual partners actually does not know my king. Don't are afraid to do this kind of king, right? Maybe just your partner, still researching about your king and want to make it a maximum experience when you have it on the first time with this kind of partner, right? But no, you're putus with the relationship too fast before this partner actually do this kind of king before this kind of king in the very first place, right? I think that sexual explorations and all the benefit that comes within can only happen when you are having a mutual faithfulness with your partner. And that is why I think that we are, as opening governments, we deserve to get winning bands at least.
Okay, next leader of the opposition.
Hi, am I audible?
Yep.
Okay, my preferred methods to BPOI is just through chat and yeah, just a few seconds to organize my paper. I'm gonna start my speech in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Under the word of opening up a session, we believe that commitment is indeed a commitment that needs to be sacred. But what we want to normalize to the school children is the teachings that relationship, feelings, and compatibility are constantly dynamic. It's constantly change, and that is something that's totally okay. Exactly because, for example, when you're starting a relationship with someone, that might come off as a healthy relationship. You might feel like you already know this person inside and out and so on and so forth. But if there's to be a constant change in the middle of that relationship, if there is, for example, comes a different priorities that happens in your relationship or a different perspective that happens between you and your partner in the future, there is again something that needs to be totally normalized. That is something that's totally justified. Breaking up and moving on to other partners is something that again should be okay, and there is no need to over glorify faithful, or there's no need to over glorify commitment to begin with, right? Because what we need to understand, something that is really missing from opening government, is that they never try to give a clear characterization about partners to begin with, right? Because we say that when it comes to romantic partners, we might feel like we already know our partner so much at the beginning of a relationship because we already know how our partners act during PDKT phase and so on and so forth. But along the way, changes are, inevitable, right? This kind of like changes of behavior, of changes of perspective, and so on and so forth, is something that is very, very inevitable. And these externalities is something that is out of our control to begin with. So the idea of commitment that when we first opt into that relationship to begin with should not be absolute, and again should not be a constraint to how we achieve happiness and so on and so forth, right? What is our goal under opening up a session? We want to give more choice, and we want to, for all of the sexual or romantic or platonic choices to become something that is extremely normalized, something that is extremely okay and accepted in societies without no stigmas and without no labels to begin with. Exactly because we believe that the only way that can determine your happiness, the only way you can pursue fulfillment, is exactly by you knowing what kind of preference do you want in your partners, or what kind of relationship do you want to have, instead of being constrained, of instead of being shackled by all of this over glorification of commitment, right? Two analyses that's going to be the contribution of opening up a session. Number one, why we said that over glorification of faithfulness, especially if you're internalizing it ever since the very early age, is going to lead into lesser flexibility for you to opt out from the relationship that you have, and also triggers more condemnation, triggers more stigma that people put if you want to opt out from the relationship to begin with, right? Two scenarios under this kind of analysis, right? In the first scenario, when it comes to worst case scenario, your partners or your relationship might take a very extreme and sudden change to begin with, right? That relationship might turn, for example, abusive, not only physically abusive, but also verbally abusive. Your partners constantly gaslight you, your partners constantly delegitimize your achievements, and your partners constantly make you question about your self-worth and so on and so forth, right? Your partners become less attentive to your needs and so on and so forth, and you find yourself stuck in a relationship with an entirely different compatibility with your partners to begin with, right? Of course, under this worst case scenario, it's going to be so much better under our side of the house when you have more flexibility to opt out from that relationship at any time, right? Without necessarily having to be put stigma or label from the society because you're seen as someone that is not faithful, someone that is not true to your commitment, and so on and so forth, right? It is easier under our side of the house for you to let go, to finally find closure, to finally move on, exactly because these choices are something that is completely acceptable and something that is completely normalized to begin with, right? And it's easier for you to let go or stop being constrained by this. No, thank you. By this toxic relationship to begin with, and to find more happiness, right? Under their side of the house, what's going to most likely happen is two things, right? Number one, either your partner is going to gaslight you for your decision to break up, for example, right? You're the one at fault because you're the one that is not faithful, and so on and so forth. Or secondly, the gaslight will come from the society who put stigmas and also labels on you as someone that is not faithful, as someone that is divorcing from your partner, or someone that is not staying true to your partners. But in the base case scenario, right, secondly, if the partners don't change and your relationship might seem okay, for example, it doesn't turn abusive and so on and so forth, we should still normalize options, and we should not still over glorify commitment to begin with, because dynamics might not happen to your partner, but it might happen to you as an individual to begin with, right? You as an individual also have the right to change. For example, maybe 2 years ago, my preference of a romantic partner is someone someone who loves to read, because I'm a huge bookworm in 2018, for example. So I feel easier and feel emotionally connected with someone who was also bookworm, for example, someone who also loves to read, and so on and so forth, right? That's why, like, Kak Dio says tadi, it's totally okay if I want to be with Dita, for example, right? Because Dita is bigger of a bookworm, and I feel, emotionally connected with this person, and so on and so forth. But now, for example, in 2020, if I want to love people who are more physically active, because now I consider myself to work out even more, and I want to, find a partner that can suit my preference ability, or, my preference inside of that physical ability, and so on and so forth. That's something that is totally okay, right? If I want to be with, I don't know, with Dio, for example, right? It's someone who is more physically active, and so on and so forth. That's totally normal for me to change, right? And this, again, this faithfulness or this idea of commitment should not constrain me for finding that happiness to begin with, right? This might seem selfish at the end of the day, but again, this is a good and this is a necessary selfishness, because at the end of the day, again, you are the only one who can determine what kind of happiness that you want inside of your life and inside of your relationship to begin with. Comparatively, what's going to happen under their side of the house is even more cheating, right? Exactly, because you're going to be forced to stick under this unhappy relationship to begin with. You're either going to be unhappy with yourself or your relationship, or number two, if you cannot hold it back anymore, you're going to be, terpaksa for cheating, for example, exactly because that is the only way for you to still find happiness, to still find fulfillment from other people without having to break up with your partner. But secondly, on the short-term level, right, it doesn't only impact how children will have relationship in the future, but also in the short term, it will also manifest into how their perspective to the world is going to look like to begin with, right? Yes, in the long term, the first analysis is a direct response to all the analysis coming from Kak Dio. But we also need to understand that in the short term, these children are probably not the one who are experiencing love relationship to begin with, right? They are probably only seeing other people or other adults doing, love, romantic relationship, and so on and so forth, probably seeing their parents and so on and so forth, right? Under our side of the house, it's going to be better if you don't over glorify commitment. For example, if their parents decide to divorce, for example, right? Their parents decide to separate, under our side of the house, exactly because choices and faithfulness is not something that is over glorified, these children will feel that it is normal for my mom and my dad, for example, to grow apart as an individual, and that is okay for people to fall out of love. And if they decided to divorce, that is something that's okay, and I need to accept, and I need to move on, and I need to find closure because I still need to study, I still need to develop my life, and so on and so forth. Instead of comparatively under their side of the house, these children will feel depressed, will blame their parents overly, and so on and so forth, exactly because they cannot come up with, find closure and also find peacefulness out of the divorce of their parents, and will not be able to actualize themselves. Never been prouder to oppose.
Okay. DPM.
Wait, let me turn on my timer.
Sorry, aku izin toilet sebentar ya.
Kalau sampai bilang, kau udah balik
Okay,
bilang.
take your time.
Hi, I'm back.
Okay, we can start.
Okay. I will start my speech in 3, 2, 1. We think that the world right now is too oversaturated with the idea that relationship is that
exhaustive, right? That relationship is that replaceable. And we think that the goal of opening government is simply to bring back the essence of faithful love, because we think that it is the thing that we need the most right now. And exactly, not a lot of people are aware that it is something that is necessary. We think that it's been far too long being too demonized, and we think that we're going to like renormalize the essence of faithful love again. Most of my rebuttals will be intertwined in my speech. I will bring two main contention. First, I will talk about the quality of relationships in itself and why it will be good regardless of the dynamic of relationship. And second of all, I will engage to the worst case that you're going to like, either you're going to be trapped or either you're going to break up from a faithful relationship, why it's still going to be better. First, let's talk about the context of the world right now, right? We think that the context of the world right now is far too enabling for infidelity, for cheating, for like people to change their partners to happen. First of all, we think that there's a rising equality and individual freedom where like women are going out in male dominated fields, LGBT people are coming out, like people are engaging in platforms that open platonic chance for an open platonic relation, which is the gateway to romance and sexual relation, right? Second of all, we think that the world right now is so focused already on individuality, things like self-development, self-care, and etc. And children's right now comparatively matures more faster in the current world that is more competitive and demanding. So we think that the characterization of the world right now is that it's very, very that individualistic, and people are already aware that they need to to make themselves as like desirable as possible, as a good and mature person as possible. So we think that that is the essence of the world right now. Wait a minute. What is the consequence then? The consequence is that people view relationship as like this very pragmatic and replaceable thing, right? Regardless of what the relationship it is. And you see that your relationship with your coworker as the same as just a relationship with your like boyfriend and girlfriend. It's just very replaceable. It needs to be there to adjust to your needs and whatever, right? With results to comparatively less happiness, exactly because of the very explorative nature of it. You are more likely to engage in like short-term relationships, and you are less you're likely to just opt out of it when you like face a certain bumps in the relationship. Meanwhile, there is something that is very, very normal in order for you to make it more perfect, to make it more suitable to your needs, right? And it's exactly what Dio means by taking your partner for granted. And so we think what we want in our what we want on our side is that we're going to like normalize the idea that like even if in 10 years you like after you are in a relationship for in 10 years, for example, you're going to be blindsided to the comfort of your soulmate, right? That you start to like wonder and seek for difference and seek for adventure, and you still end up regretting it. This is the kind of thing that we're going to open to children from as early as possible. We think that in our side what will happen is that first, people are less likely to engage in red flags, and this is important because we think that unhappiness in relationship that is explained by Muti comes from the wonder that what if this is not the one, and etc, etc. And we think that in our side people are more likely to commit to the relationship and have the willingness to make themselves become the one, to make themselves become suitable for their partner, and less likely to become abusive. First of all, we think that people are less likely to engage in red flags because we think that exactly the moment that you're going to like commit to someone for a long time, the moment that this person is like raising their hand at you at your first fight, for example, it's going to like send this red flag in your head, and you will immediately think that, oh, okay, this is a big issue that needs to be taken care of, or I'm going to opt out, right? That is the kind of, we think that the desire to like opt out but still better the relationship can only happen in our side. You'll be more careful. You will make sure that your partner have laid out all the unnegotiable common ground that you have. You will bring early on that you want or not want children, for example. How much codependency do you want financially, for example? How vanilla or how kinky you are in sexual relationship, for example. We think that these are the kind of things that is going to be pushed to the surface in a relationship the moment that there is a commitment at hand, right? The moment that you know that you're going to be expected to be faithful, those are the things that people are going to lay out in the very first place when they're just like PDKT even, we think. So we think that there is a good strat, right? Because that it makes people less likely to opt into like the wrong relationship or like this abusive relationship that has been explained by Mutu. But even if it's that bad, right? And this is unfortunate, but we think that psychologists and relationship therapists exist not only for the abused, but also for the abuser. In opposition side, unfortunately, abuser have less desire to change and have less desire to be able to see that they're in the wrong, because they can always dabble in the honeymoon phase of every relationship that they're going to opt into, right? Because they will always be seen as super. Is it putus-putus?
Enggak kok.
Hello? Oh, okay. Because they will always be seen as being super desirable at the early stage of their relationship, right? And that is why it's easy for abuser to say that, oh, it's just your fault
Yo,
because you're
ma'am.
unfaithful and etc. etc. And I'm still desirable and people still want me anyway because they're like maybe psychopathic and seems really, really charming at the start. We think that this kind of people are going to be really, really undesirable in our sight, right? Because now people are looking for long-term committed relationship. And there is the moment that they're not going to look at the fuckboys. They're not going to look at the man who will raise their hand. They're not going to look at the woman who's like to like emotionally manipulate them and etc etc. That's why we think that people are more likely going to be aware of that kind of red flags in our side of the world before 6 years.
This is a POI to both opening. Why do you guys think that you need to teach children relationships, sex, and etc. Right? That's too much information. That's very unnecessary.
We think this is important to know from children because if you want your benefit of like exploration and etc. to fly, we think that you also need to double to the idea that the children needs to know this, and that's the only way that our benefit can also fly. So once people have the willingness to work it out, and not in a way that is compromising your comfort, but in a way that feels secure to try out challenging things, and not being afraid that you won't be accepted just because you suck at it. Maybe you suck at like very kinky sex, for example, but you're not afraid that you're going to be a judge for it because you know that your soulmate is going to like just laugh it out, just laugh it off, and just still like you anyway. This is the kind of comfort and security that you will not get in the opposition side of the house, because then you become very replaceable. You always question yourself that you're not enough. You always feel like, oh, I need to master a lot of things. I need to know a lot of things in order for me to be able to like be the perfect partner. Or otherwise, this person is just gonna see me as an opportunity cost, and they're going to leave me because there is maybe as Ian Sommerhalder out there. There is more handsome and more achieving and whatever, right? There is the kind of insecurity that we think will always happen because exactly people think that other people can be replaceable, but they don't realize that the replaceability also is placed within them the moment that they apply that kind of narrative to everyone, right? So we think that that inherent insecurity will always happen if we tell children from very young age that, hey, it's okay for you to care about yourself first. It's okay for you to like just throw away anyone who is not able to suit with your change, to suit with your development and improvement, to not like the books that you read and etc., right? We think that is not the kind of thing that we want to teach our children. We think it's important, even if you end up breaking up or divorcing, we understand it will be more painful in our side, but the growth will be significantly better because love comes in phase. First, you will learn about others, and then second, you will learn about yourself, and the last breakup, finally, you can learn about what you expect in a relationship and what expectation you can expect for others, and to what boundaries you can change and not change, right? We think that even if the breakup will be much more painful in our side, it will be significantly lesser in number, but also it will be significantly greater in growth, and that is important to maintain a quality relationship in the future. That's why we proud to propose.
That's all right. Thanks for the sharing, Kagabe, to open the closing half. I call upon member of government.
I will start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Opening cases are merely talking about the benefits of telling people about toxic relationship and whatnot. While in fact, this motion clearly stated that we are going to talk about children. Why are we going to actively teach them?
Feli, sorry, I lost your voice.
Okay, sorry, I was unmuted. Let's just start over, yeah? I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Opening cases merely talk about how relationship should look like, how it's going to be like in the future for the kids when you're telling them, for example, about faithfulness, that you are going to opt in or opt out of a relationship. Although I think all of these things are going to be very complex if you're going to teach primary school or even middle school or even high school children, because I don't think I am able to actually do all those kinds of things that, weighing the opportunity cost that both opening sides are going to talk about. There are two things that I'm going to talk in my speech. Number one is how do kids process the information we're going to tell them. Second, how does it going to impact the kids' life? All the battles are integrated, but before moving on to all those explanations, I'm going to clarify several things. Number one, we think that actively teach can will be differ from the case of opening government, where they would like to have that in curriculum. We think that actively teaching will look like, for example, having the ethic class, letting them to have, discussion like Sunday morning church in church, for example, all those kind of, telling them how relationship is like, what are the type of relationship, what is faithful means. For example, it means, for example, trust and loyalty, which means that you have to love someone, you shouldn't lie to anyone, you shouldn't be greedy for anything, and at the same time you should also be gentle towards another person in order to not hurt anyone. Second of all, we think that all these kind of things shouldn't be evaluated in a form like, for example, grading them to pass whether they pass this faithfulness test or not, because at the end of the day, our goals is very simple. We would like to tell these kids that faithful is a good virtue and cheating is quite immoral, because you're going to hurt someone else as well as hurting yourself in the process. At the end of the day, all of this complexity are going to be hard for the kids to understand. First contention, how do kids process the information? In opening opposition, they said that having all this relationship capable for kids to understand is because there will be a happiness and fulfillment that people can have. We think that the parameter of happiness and fulfillment inside opening opposition will only look like people are going to find all this happiness and fulfillment in another person instead of feeling themselves with happiness that they can find for themselves, for example. And even more, when their side of the house are talking about how people are going to be cheating, for example, and so on and so forth, we think all those kind of cases are going to happen because people are not faithful in the very first place. The moment that they get into relationship, they have the matrix of whether this person is attractive, whether this person is the one that is able to suit my fulfillment, to suit my needs, instead of actually working together in that particular relationship. In our side of the house, even if there is a cheating, for example, that might exist, we think that people are still able to openly telling the reasons why they do so, the reasons that at the end of the day, I will still be honest with you regardless. So first go back to my case. How do kids process the information? We think that it's very important for us to actively teach kids, because they are during the developmental stage where mindset and conditioning are going to be very significantly helpful for them in the process of getting that in the future. Example is that there is a culture, for example, bowing in front of older people is very important because you are probably younger and you have to be respectful for other people. Those kinds of things are being taught, and it's still lingering even until now, when there is no more idea of actually bowing in front of older people. But I think that it's very important to teach them, because during this time it's a cognitive development that these kids actually have. They're able to see whether this discussion is going to be very beneficial for them in the future. There is a case that possibly opposition are going to talk about, that kids will learn as they grow up, and they are going to actually able to navigate relationship when they reach the age and actually experience that themselves. We think that it's a wrong example that they are going to have, because at the end of the day, they will have that it's possible for me to find anyone that I want, and at the end of the day, opt in and opt out of relationship because it doesn't fulfill my need. In our side of the house, we think that teaching them are going to be like in a form of discussion by telling them what are the definitions of faithfulness, that you have to be, you have to have trust and loyal towards someone. For example, you shouldn't lie to take more candies just because you think that it's going to fulfill your need. All those kinds of things are going to be good for them. Two things that happen in the discussion. First, they will possibly go home and talk with their parents. They will ask their parents, what does daddy or mommy means to you? What does all of this relationship means to you? Why can you love your spouses? Why can you actually exchange that and be able to have me, for example? But in the worst case, that there are no example of parents, we think that there will still be possibility of change, because kids now able to actually openly talk about relationship in the public places, especially in school. And later on, even if in the talk with their peers, there are going to be exchanges of idea of love. That love is not something about playing the others. Love is not about, getting the most handsome guy, getting the most pretty girl, for example, in the class. Therefore, in our side of the house, there is no more normalizing fuckboy fuck girls that will result into all kinds of hurt that opening opposition is trying to talk to you. Second of all, how does it going to impact the kids' life? We say that in the comparative, they say that we are not able to rationalize ourselves. It's different from the case of how actually
Why?
rational and being not rational in terms of having this experience. We think that when you are experiencing a first love or actually getting into a relationship, you have to have that idea first. What relationship are you going to pursue? What kind of fulfillment that you need, instead of only experiencing all those kinds of relationship and then finally I will find my choices, I will find all this definition that I want at the end of the day. So in our side of the house, rationalization still exists, and in the case of abuse, we think that you can still opt out of that because it's different, because it's just like you are already being not loyal and you are not being loving for me because you broke that relationship at the end of the day. In the long term, we say that as all of this, that benefit of conditioning the kids to actually be able to understand that they have to be faithful to a certain person. There is no case of like toxic relationship, because toxic relationship stem from the fact that there is a trust that is being broken by one person, that is leading to another person being always questioned whether they are loyal to you, or having all this insecurity that I'm not enough and therefore that person will actually cheat on me. All of these are vicious cycle. We think that red flags should be seen and be taught earlier, so at the end of the day the relationship will be more dynamic, will be open, and will be helpful for both partners. Thank you.
Okay, to open the case of CO, member of opposition.
Hi, I'm Kindi, member of OP. Kalau misalnya ada BOI, chat aja, I will respond kok. Okay? Okay. Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The biggest contribution coming from closing opposition is that we are going to challenge all teams. Why then you have the urgency to teach children anything about relationship, right? The stance of closing opposition is this: we are going to, for example, what we would teach for the children is that, yeah, one day you will find a partner, it's normal, love is humane, there's marriage, right? For example, and in sixth grade, for example, you are going to teach biological knowledge about pregnancy. Yeah, that's okay. What we won't do is that we're not going to give them any tips, not going to spend airtime, or like, for example, airtime to do curriculums on relationships. We don't think that is the jurisdiction nor the prerogative of schools, especially for children. That is very clear. We think that let them learn that at adults, for example, at teens, for example, in like celibacy clubs, or in in the process of them becoming older, right? We're not gonna spend time to do that as a children, right? So we think that that's clearly the distinction CO with every other team, because opening opposition still want to actually teach them things about relationship, right? So we think that rather than having throwing out 100 different random scenarios like the opening debate, what we are going to do is that we are going to directly analyze, number one, the prerogative of the principle of education, why education needs to be levels and tailored towards the children necessity and the capacity of the children, and thus the answer is that no, we don't need to do this kind of things. But number two, we are also going to say that children does not have the full knowledge of it, that's why you cannot teach them this, right? But before any of that, I'm going to directly engage, coming from closing government. Closing government said that the normalcy of the people is that they are not faithful, right? OG also mentioned this. We think that no, A minus, because we think that unfaithful is something that is really unpopular, right? Monogamous relationship is everywhere on television, for example, or actor or actresses that are having that selingkuh, for example, will be shamed, and the people who are having divorce, their children will be their children's name will have dirt, for example, and they will be shamed and said that they are broken families, right? So we think that the norm is actually people should be faithful, and that's the norm. And given that's the norm, why do we need to spend extra miles to teach children to actually be faithful, right? We don't understand this. Okay, by that stance, I'm going to talk about two things. Number one, why children does not have the full knowledge of it, that's why it will be harmful. Number two, I'm going to talk about the principle of education. Okay. Yeah, so basically a relationship comprises of tons of things, right, and elements. For example, talking about personalities, culture, human psychology, tolerance, and sex. This is something important. We don't necessarily we think that children does not necessarily have the full understanding of that. If they will be, for example, brainwashed into making things, making decisions that they don't understand, nor they are not, for example, nor they are not consensual for it, right? So for example, it's like teaching children how why you need to actually be religious from the beginning, for example, and teaching children to be Democrat, for example, from the beginning, right? We think that it creates two harm. Number one, it actually takes away the agency of the children to actually make key decisions in their life. You brainwash them, then the choices of their life later will, for example, will not be because of their conscience, but because of the things that you actually are talking to them. But number two is that the harm when they don't have the full knowledge is that there are so many harms in this, right? For example, when they face a toxic relationship, when they face people who are behaving badly, because they are constantly being brainwashed that you need to be faithful to them, for example, or because they are being told from the early age every relationship is something that you need to work on and that can be worked on, for example. So these are the narrative that is out of place and something that is not necessary to actually be told by the children. So in conclusion of it, we don't necessarily think in conclusion of it, they don't have the full knowledge of it. That's why it's not for them. But number two is that the principal education is that you need to have levels of education, and the level needs to be tailored to the necessity and the capacity of the children, right? Note that education on the early age focuses on teaching the basic morality because it shapes a person. You do not lie, you need to be charitable, you need to be smart, you need to be those kind of things. You don't have the emotional capability as children to understand sex, to understand romantic relationship, to understand consent, and we don't think that's the time yet for them, because partners and marriages includes filial responsibility, financial burden. It includes decision making process as a team, for example. They don't necessarily understand, and we think that at that time they don't need to understand any of it, right? It's totally unnecessary. Okay, so what are the examples of it? So for example, POICG after this. So for example, after children are in their early teens when they have period, then we have, for example, education about celibacy or education about consensual sex, because at the end of the day they need to do it, right? Or you teach high school courses on entrepreneurship, how to be independent, because they are at the right moment to be independent, right? So education needs to have these kind of spectrums and levels in order for you to in order for you to prepare the actor that are in the courses of education in order for them to be a better person. And we think that this is so out of range and so not necessary. Yes, Feli, I will take you.
Then we think that teaching them to actually be faithful, for example, be honest to others, will create the discussion of having monogamous and polyamorous relationship, which is the choice that you want to champion.
Okay, number one, we think that what I already told to you is that that is already a popular narrative in the society. Why do you need to teach them in a curriculum? But number two, we think that the harm of it is that the children will perceive it as something that is monogamous relationship is something that is absolutely right. But what we know is that throughout the life and the courses of our life, we know that there are liberal ideas, or we know there are dynamics of a relationship. There are casual relationship, or you don't necessarily need to be partners, and etc. Right? That's one. But number two is that what we think that we want these children to be is for them to be dynamic and as receptive as possible, so they can, for example, react to the way that is as mature as possible, but not necessarily fighting for monogamy, because not all relationship is worth fighting for. Sometimes when you go to LDR, when you go to, for example, your parents fighting you, you need to understand the balance of it and not sacrificing yourself in order for you to be in a toxic relationship. We think that after talking about all of this, the team that needs to win is the team that understands children as an actor and understands education as an institution. We think that no team actually frames it. Yeah, CG frames a bit, but we think that CO is still better from doing it. We think that that needs to be the debate, not about your personal experience in dating. Thank you, guys.
Okay, thanks, Kindi, for the speech. To close the case of government with.
Right, Tess, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, I start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Mr. Chair, notice that the only side that is bringing the clear characterization about whether or not we should actively teach school children to actually be faithful in itself is only the most of debating in itself happening in the closing bench, because all the thing that is discussed in the opening bench only on the closing bench, right? Because the only thing that is merely discussed in the opening bench in itself is actually post about having in a deep relationship in itself, about what is exactly happening inside the relationship in itself. We believe that it's the consequences that has happened inside the relationship, but these consequences coming after we actually discussing a way much better, the more prioritized argument that we need to be count at the very first place, in whether or not we should actively teach school children as a main actor, as a main stakeholder that we need to consider at the very first place. So only debating happen in the closing bench right now. So as a as a government whip, there are several things that I need to address in this debate. First of all, is that whether or not we should actively teach school children to be faithful in this actor that we're talking about school, and second of all, about how it brings betterment towards every stakeholders. We're discussing about children, school, and parents. But before going to that classes, let's take a look about the closing opposition case, right? First of all, they talk about how the urgency teach children about relationship also. They talk about it is not urgent. They talk about how it is not in the school jurisdiction, and it's not the responsibility of the school in itself to actively teach their teach these children. First of all, we believe that it is merely the jurisdiction in the jurisdiction of the school in itself, because the fact that their parents in itself uh, have the responsibility to actually teach them, but considering that the status quo in itself, these children may not have, the actual get the actual information that is needed to actually know what faithful it is, or what is exactly the relationship that is needed to be faithful at the very first place. Because we considering that the status quo, the most of parent in itself not actively teach their children, we believe who is the responsible actor. We believe the most responsible actor in itself is the place where the children in itself have spent a lot of their times goes on, and that's happened in school when they're meet with their peers, with their with their teacher in itself. We believe that it's also happened in it's the responsibility of the school in itself and in a part of the jurisdiction. Second of all, they talk about how it is very complicated. Very clearly stated that we are not taking this into a curriculum state, because considering the fact that our curriculum is very strict, we believe that the fact that Valley State it comes into like ethic class or moral class in itself, or Sunday preaching something. We believe that the idea on how you actually encourage these children in itself toward the open discussion. This is not as complicated as you explaining biological something toward the children at the very first place. You actually asking them whether or not, what do you think about the faithfulness in your relationship? What is exactly happening in your, what happens, what is your current love state, for example, in school children in the sub, what is exactly your feelings. That is exactly the discussion that happens inside that class or inside that meeting rooms. It is not as complicated as characterized as the opposition side of the house. So we believe all the argument about all the things about how complicated it is not gonna stand in this debate. Lastly, about the idea of the brainwash, we believe that is very extreme case, right? Because let's talk about the choice in itself. We believe the choice or decision in itself becomes legitimate if you have a proper amount of information, both in faithfulness or unfaithfulness at the very first place. The fact that we are not encouraged at the very first place on how faithful idea in itself being exposed uh, in the society or even in the school, as children know what is faithful is, in fact that you are not actually you know create a rational decision at the very first place. So we believe the idea of rationality happen in our side of the house, because we give the same amount of proportion and same amount of exposure for them at the right time, at the right moment. So let's move on why we believe that the children as an important actor. We believe that, as Feli mentioned before, we believe that this is a part of the cognitive development, where this is called a golden age, where you can process all the information based on the thing that you practically, or you saw it in your eyes. You actually process that information. We believe with that children characteristic in itself, there are the best. Children are the best actor to actually carry all of this faithful issue, as well as the fact that they're gonna grow up and start their own relationship, right? Second of all, it's also contributing on how it's create prevention. When the opening opposition say that it may contain the abusive relationship, we believe that abusive relationship in itself happens because you are unfaithful at the very first place, because you're not trusting your partners at the end of the day, because you are not value them as they are supposed to be. We believe that faithful teaching method in itself, as we actively encourage in school in itself, also carrying that information, how you actually respond and how you actually, menghargai your partners. That is exactly how the impact in kids' life. So what we proved to you in the first classes, that we should actively teach school children, because first of all, children as important actor, and they have that capacity to actually process that information. And second of all, we believe that the characterization that coming out in the opening opposition, it's not clear enough, and we believe that brainwash itself not happen. Second of all, how it brings betterment towards every stakeholders. Let's talk about several stakeholder here. Let's talk about children, school, and parents. Let's talk about children first, right? We believe that the betterment that's gonna happen in itself, that the children have that opportunity in itself to actually know deep about the information of faithful, because sometimes faithful in itself, it doesn't mean that you actually committed to the toxic relationship. Faithful mean at a certain, at a certain, it's not, when you start a relationship, you're not stupid enough to actually stay in this certain abusive relationship. We believe that rationality actually happen at the very first place, and we believe sometimes people opt out when they are think, they are misjudged or mistreated as a human being. So we believe that rationality happen in our side of the house. Is in this case, when we talk about children, they actually learn from that, from the experience that their parents may be going through. We believe that also affects their life even bigger. Second of all, let's talk about parents, because since opposition talk about divorce, we believe that in divorce case, why it is way much better in our side of the house. First, we believe that if we teach about the idea of faithfulness in itself, at least the actively teaching school will actually have the duty to actually teach children to be faithful. They actually know what is the true meaning of divorce in itself, because when at the time you saw that your parents divorced at the very first place, you actually can encourage yourself to know that this has happened because maybe your parents not be unfaithful at the very first place, and therefore you learn from that mistake. Second of all, we believe that even if it is happened in opposition side of the house, the best scenario, or the best scenario that might happen in their side of the house, is that these two parents in itself divorce because they just want to explore themselves, or maybe they're not unfaithful at the very first place. So we've shown you that whether or not we should vote for closing government. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Government Whip, for that speech to close the debate. Axel.
Lu tes dulu audible apa enggak?
Check, am I audible?
Lu jangan di sana. Di sana Zoom.
Nggak kedengeran ya?
Audible enggak?
Kedengeran.
Oke. Udah berdua. Oke, gue udah tiba-tiba dulu.
Oke. Gelap.
Kelihatan nggak?
Okay, we think that until the end of the day, we still don't hear, and in any sides that, not necessarily that we need to teach this overwhelming information regarding relationships to children, right? This is and in CO we have clearly portrayed to you that at the end of the day, when you do this, when school does this, it violates the principle that you should have levels of your education, that it violates your children's agency of their choice, and how at the end of the day this is going to be bad in the future, because you imprint them with this idea that this should be the only thing that's right, to be faithful to your partner, and it's going to be stick to them until they're older, and it's going to lead to them not being able to find escape mechanisms to different situations of relationship. That's why in CO it's clear that we don't want to introduce them to the world of dating and romantic relationships since this very young age, right? All right. Why is with two engagements, right? Why do we need to kick out OG from this debate? Because
OGBY.
we think that first of all that the first case talking about first love. So we don't forget they necessarily explain to you why a faithful first love isn't going to be why a faithful. We say that a faithful first love isn't always going to be good anyway, right? Because it can still be toxic, it can still be possessive. Why is it likely to be like that? Because it's the first time, right? And the instinct of these kids when they want they date each other in SD, for example, is to be possessive, right? And is to not they're not equipped with the knowledge of boundaries, like what Kindi said. That's why it's going to be bad. This is going to be worsened when you try to imprint to them the idea of faithfulness, because because uh because you won't likely have the instinct to opt out. You will more likely to stay faithful, right? You're not supposed to do that in toxic relationships. Why is this better in closing opposition? I think that children will be able to will be able to judge by themselves whether or not this is still uh, uh, this situation is where they should be faithful or not, or they don't have to date at all because they're not yet sexually aroused to do that. They haven't reached puberty, right? We're not going we're not going to introduce them to those stuff yet. Even engaging to Grace's
Before
case,
that,
talking about escape mechanisms. No, thank you. We think that we think that what Grace didn't explain is necessarily how can you notice red flags in the beginning of when you see someone, right? You're not going to notice if they're vanilla or kinky since in the first place. You're more likely to notice that in the middle of the relationship. And the second question would be that how will you opt out when you're in the middle of a relationship, when you have committed and thought to be faithful, right? It's not going to happen. That's OG is our thing. All right. Talking next up, opening to the moving to OO, right? We agree with the cases that how OO wants to have options and etc. But with options in dating and romance and etc. Right? But what OO never explained is why does this need to be talked about in to school children, right? When they're still in elementary school. Kini has already told to you that at the end of the day, when they have no capacity, whatever they learn and whatever choices they make based on these curriculums is not going to be meaningful, right? Because they don't understand economic capability, they don't understand filial responsibility. They don't, at the end of the day, their choices are just going to be based on what they're taught, right? They're not going
BOI.
to understand and adapt to different situations, right? Okay, sure, OG.
Why closing discussion about technicalities is important ya. Soalnya if we can actively instill about the importance of rukun iman and rukun Islam in Asmaul Husna dari kecil, we can also actively instill this narrative without problem. So we can just assume teachingnya masuk, therefore materialization of harm in OG jadi much more important class in this debate.
Yeah, sure. We don't necessarily say that introducing rukun iman or religion in the essential person from their kid is good, right? Because they don't understand. They should be able to, in the ideal world, you should be able to choose whether or not you want to believe in that. They don't. No, we don't think that children understand what rukun iman is supposed to do, right? And they just know, they just memorize that and they just think that that's right. No, that's not the kind of education we want, right? Okay, exactly. But okay, moving on. Regarding next to the continuing to OO, right? So so at the end of the day, what will happen in OO's world is just that it's only going to incite curiosity in the children's mind, and this is going to be harmful, right? Because romantic relationships in itself is complex, right? And when you do not have the capacity to deal with it, it's probably going to be harmful to you. So, for example, children will likely to become overwhelmed with this kinds of relationship because, for example, they cannot handle the dopamine hit of holding someone's hand that you like, right? But and this is going to be worse because I think it actually will take a lot of their time and a lot of their learning capacity doing something instead of learning the basics of relationships in friendships that they have to learn first before moving on to this, right? And it's going to be harmful. And in conclusion, we think that at the end of the day, teaching all of this problem coming from OO is already all harms are mitigatable in the later stages when you and teaching them later, and and when they have when they are one capable of learning it, and two they have the urgency when they actually want to date someone, right? But lastly, let's talk about CG, right? CG's idea is just they want to instill this idea of faithfulness since the since the very first place, since in very early age. So we think that first of all it's very their idea is that the rationality is when they have proper information from both sides, right, whether teaching or not. We think that this argument coming from government web is already dismissive to Kindi's analysis, right? Because Kindi already told you that it's not going to be a rational information and not something that the children could use in rationality, whether or not it's on the cheating side, on the faithful side, when they aren't able to actually comprehend what is the the aspects of relationship, how you should actually, or what does this problem look like. And secondly, also they never explain to you the urgency in the very first place, when we have been clear that even if people are are unfaithful by nature, but we think that it's already unpopular, right? People will look at their moms and will look at movies and see that monogamous relationship in every place already exists. So faithfulness is already imprinted, and there's no need to teach this to children. Proud to oppose.
Hi everyone. Thanks for the debate. Yeah, it was quite, frankly, without any sugarcoating, I think it was a quite enjoyable debate. Thanks for sharing all of your personal thoughts and like some intellectual stimulating concepts as well. Me and my panels have come to a consensus decision to make this debate an opposition bench debate, with the first place going to closing opposition, second place going to opening opposition, third place going to opening government, and fourth place, unfortunately, going to closing government. Reason why is as follows. First of all, why do we think closing government got fourth? So comparing closing government to all other three sides in this debate. First, comparing CG to OG. We feel like closing government's case direction is very correct and is very potential for you guys to say that we are going to talk about why this is important for children and why this is important to be taught in school times. In fact, like, we have considered you guys to be the top two initially because of that case direction, but after some reassessment of the content of the case, we felt like the case have three main comparisons in comparison to what OG said. Number one, we feel like the majority of the benefits that you guys have is basically the premise coming from opening government, but it's just packaged as to why this is important for children. Like, what do I mean by this? For example, it's a statement of it's the statement of we need to make people realize that relationship goes beyond fuck boys or like fuck girls, or like the benefits of we need to make people recognize the struggles of the parents that have been going through divorce, for example. We feel like such premises have been identified by the opening government, where they talk in length about how people must be avoided of completely individualistic perspective of relationships at all costs, and the people should also be avoided of the pain of people being abusive to themselves because they feel like the person is not faithful to them. So thus far, we felt like the premise coming from closing government is basically what we just said, but this is good for children. But what was missing, we feel like, why are those benefits that opening government identified is specifically important for children's life in a nuance that is different in comparison to what opening government said. And because we don't feel like such unique nuances exist as to what is the further benefits then if people don't identify relationship as just limited to fuck boys or like individualistic people, because of the lack of extension coming from closing government related to that benefit, we feel like ultimately the packaging coming from the packaging coming from closing government is not sufficient to distinguish you guys in comparison to what opening government said. Secondly, we feel like the opening government have also attempted to frame this as to why this is important for children. However, it's not as explicit as what you guys said. like it does come in the POI. Like for example, when Grace responded to the POI given by Kindi, when Kindi asked why this is important for children to teach, what Grace said was that this is important in order for the benefits of children having a good life to fly. And also like when Dio also brought a POI to the last speech, to the opposition whip speech, saying that why do we need to care about discussions related to technicalities while we could have discussed about the while we could have just discussed about the concept in itself and like just assume that the benefits are immediately materializing and so on and so forth. We felt like that is an attempt which was not substantiated by opening government. Like we felt like it was quite a one-liners, two-liners coming from OG. But at least we felt like there is an attempt of opening government to identify why this is good for the children. And we feel like, again, because we don't feel like the packaging of children in this current in this specific comparison between CG and OG as the most important part of the debate, we felt like it's further justified to give OG above closing government. And lastly, about the mechanism coming from closing government, about actively teaching an ethics class, discussion in Sunday morning church, discussion by your parents, etc., etc. I think like this is I think this is more feasible if it is compared to what closing opposition said. But if it is directly compared to what opening government said, we feel like again like the how is identifying us doing discussions via ethics class or discussion morning church is more contributive in comparison to OG's mechanism of curriculum something something. I don't think it was identified by closing government or like why ethics class is more contributive in comparison to curriculum that is national, because we don't feel like that is the bulk of the debate coming from the opening government. So because of those three reasons, we felt like comparison of CG and CG and OG, CG places below opening government. Comparing CG to opening opposition, we felt like what opening opposition have identified and was quite not responded to by the closing government is the idea on how sometimes the reason why people opt out of a relationship is not simply because people are abusive, but because people can change, and that's okay, because it just happens so that people grow apart and like and the world just moves on from each other. And we feel like the case coming from closing government is again seems to be quite premised on the idea on how being faithful means good. Being faithful means you prevent all of the fuckboys that seems to be the default if you don't become faithful. While opening opposition have identified that oftentimes the reason as to why you don't become faithful is not because you are a jerk, but simply because you are, but simply because factors that you cannot control. And even if you don't become not faithful, then you are going to suffer a damage to yourself. Like you're going to explode because you have to go through someone who you don't love anymore, who your feelings have faded with, because of the lack of engagement coming from closing government on that regard. With like opening opposition in this specific part is more contributive. But even if you want to talk about the contribution about preventing fuckboys from dominating and like preventing people from perceiving the relationships as abusive, people from perceiving relationships as abusive, we felt like opening opposition have also done well to engage on this regard. Like for example, when opening opposition have argued that that oftentimes the damage that you have from suffering the damage that you have from suffering abusive relationships is not something that's mutual exclusive, in the sense that if you don't break up, then you're going to suffer through the damages of an abusive relationship. But if you do decide to break up, you will suffer the damage from the breaking up itself. But the distinction is trauma can recover, you can still find people and find friends, and it can also be a learning experience for yourself as opposed to being stuck with a person who is emotionally abusive to you for the rest of your life. So we felt like the engagement coming from opening opposition is one step ahead in comparison to what TG said. And because of the lack of engagement coming to that regard, we felt like opening opposition is also more conducive in comparison to CG. Lastly, comparing CG to CO, this is also going to be the comparison between CO and all other three sides. But just to flag that out first, we felt like what closing opposition have identified correctly is why children in specific doesn't have the capacity to rationalize all of these things. And do note that earlier on, I said that the framing of CG is correct, but the content is unfortunately quite similar in nuance with what OG said. However, we felt like the case direction of CO is not only different in comparison to OO, but the content of the case in itself is significantly different as well. While opening opposition talks about the importance of us not being faithful, closing opposition talks about in specific why children have other priorities and are incapable to be taught things that are really complex, such as romantic relationships, because romantic relationships involve a lot of things, such as personal responsibility to your partner, kinky or vanilla sex, um, team decision making that is exclusive only to two people, etc., etc. Like all of those three nuances is not something that children are able to identify with and are able to process with correctly, which means that the process of the teaching in itself is not something that's going to be ideal. And moreover, we felt like what closing operation said is also the idea on how methods of relationship goes beyond monogamous relationship and like just the conventional ones. Like for example, liberal ideas such as kumpul kebo or like open relationships is a thing, which means that we must be able to maximize the agency of the children as much as possible so as to not be stuck in the perception that being faithful is always good. We felt like this is an engagement coming from the closing opposition that closing government again does not manage to engage in a convincing manner. Like I do understand that there is an engagement coming from the government whip when government whip said that we're going to teach this with the right amount of exposure at the right moment. But like, I don't think that this is sufficient to tackle the structural reasoning coming from closing opposition about the psychological state of children. Like, why is the myriad of explanation about the psychological state of children coming from CO is sufficient to be tackled by a mechanistic explanation of we are going to teach this in ethics class or a discussion in Sunday morning church. So because of that concluded by me and the other panels as not sufficient, we felt like that's the reason why closing government positions forth in this debate. Okay, so that's quite a lengthy one, but that's okay since this is a sparring session. Okay, next, comparing opening government to both opening opposition and closing opposition. I think like the comparison is quite similar to what I did with closing government because again, I feel like at least partially the case of closing government have a very similar nuance to what opening government said, which is why I feel like the case coming from opening government as well is below what ONCO said because again, I think like the case coming from opening opposition have identified that sometimes you're just not a toxic jerk if you want to move on from someone. Sometimes it's just you grow up apart from each other and that's perfectly fine. Like I do understand that is an attempt coming from opening government to frame this by arguing that the context of the world is far too enabling for individuality, like the focus on individual freedom, kids maturing too fast in this world, etc., etc. However, we felt like this is not something that's sufficient because number one, opening opposition have I argued why individuality itself is something that's justified because yeah, sometimes you're going to be the one that's damaged yourself if you get stuck in a relationship with someone who you don't love. And secondly, we felt like the way opening opposition frames this is not by saying that individuality means you are a jerk, but individuality just means that you change, and that's fine. Because of that, we felt like the preemptive framing coming from opening government is not sufficient to tackle the opening opposition argument on that regards. But secondly, even if you want to talk about the abusive relationships that opening government talks, again, I feel like the responses coming from Kagabe in specific is quite nice to respond to this by saying that trauma can recover and like you can be receiving a good learning experience from this. But the comparative is that you're going to be stuck with someone who you hate for the rest of your life because you are forced to be faithful. You are subject to all of those stigmas, and like the harm of insecurity is not the harm of insecurity or like abusive relationships is not something that's mutual exclusive given the context that The damage happens on both sides. If you leave, you will face damage from the initial period. If you stay, you will face damage, but it is even more worse because you face it in a much longer time frame. Um, so yeah, because of that, we felt like opening government is less in comparison to OO. Compared this to CO, like again, I felt like the contextualization of CO when they talk about why children is not sufficient to process this as the tipping point that wants to closing opposition to all sides in this round. Dio have brought a POI to say that why technicality matters, while we could have just talked about Rukun Iman, Rukun Islam, and that's it. But yeah, I think Axel responded to this by quite well by saying that, well, yeah, Rukun Iman and Rukun Islam is not also something that's ideal because children cannot process that. We want independence of thought as much as possible. And furthermore, I feel like the argument coming from closing opposition is also quite potential to respond to what Uji said when Kindi responded by saying that unfaithfulness is not a default. You have a lot of norm of people condemning celebrities that got divorced with each other, something along those lines. Now, again, I don't think it was compared to opening governance contextualization about individuality. So both contributions can be true. I don't win one argument over the other on this specific clash, but because of the other contributions at CO1, we felt like opening government is also below closing opposition. And yeah, that's why OG got third. Lastly, comparing O and CO, again, same comparison, CO, very good mechanization of benefits, arguing why this is not feasible. Closing operation have also argued why sometimes we need to enable agency of people to like explore as much ideas as possible. It's not the time for children to learn all of these advanced concepts, which means that the benefit coming from open operation can only run with COs, not that, which means that the argument coming from opening operation is less contributive because you guys have not been able to prove why children are able to rationalize all of the sophisticated arguments that opening operation brought, and closing operation have argued that this is impossible for the children to process. It is much better for us to prioritize other things instead. So like that's why closing operation gets first in this debate. So yeah, that's that.